Most people assume that every vegetable garden has to start over from scratch every single spring. Dig the bed, buy the seeds, plant, water, wait, and then do it all over again the next year and the year after that. But here's the surprising truth. Some vegetables you plant only once, and they keep feeding you for months, for seasons, and in one remarkable case, for nearly 2 decades from a single planting. You don't need a big yard for this. You don't need raised beds, an irrigation system, or a weekend of back-breaking work. A few pots on a balcony, a sunny patch by the patio, a corner of the smallest yard. That's enough, because the secret to harvesting all year long isn't more space or more effort, it's choosing the right plants. Plants that regrow themselves while you sit back and watch. So today we're counting down 7 vegetables you plant once and harvest again and again. We'll start with the easy, reliable ones, and we'll build all the way up to number 1, a single plant that can keep producing fresh harvests for 15 to 20 years after you put it in the ground just one time. Most people have no idea it grows beautifully in a container. Before we begin, do something simple for me. Drop your growing zone or your state in the comments. It takes 5 seconds and it tells you and everyone else here which of these plants will keep coming back where you live. So let's get started. At number 7 we have Swiss chard, and most people lump it in with lettuce, something you plant, harvest once and pull out, but chard isn't built that way at all. It's what gardeners call a cut and come again crop, and it's also a biennial. That means a single plant naturally lives across 2 growing seasons, not one. So while your neighbor is reseeding their greens every few weeks, one chard plant can keep feeding you for the better part of a year, sometimes longer. Here's why it works. Chard grows from a central crown, pushing out new leaves from the middle while the older, larger leaves wait on the outside. When you harvest, you never cut the whole plant. You take only the outer leaves, snapping or cutting them off close to the base, and you leave the small inner leaves untouched. Those inner leaves become next week's harvest. The plant simply keeps producing from the center again and again as long as the crown stays healthy, and it thrives in a container. A pot that holds about 3 gallons, roughly 10 to 12 inches across and just as deep, is plenty for a single plant. Fill it with a quality potting mix, not heavy garden soil, because chard roots want air and steady moisture without sitting in water. Keep it watered so the soil feels like a wrung-out sponge, and give it about 6 hours of sun, though chard is forgiving and tolerates some afternoon shade better than most greens. The mistake that ends a chard plant early is harvesting greedily. If you strip every leaf at once, you take away the plant's ability to feed itself, and it stalls. Take 1/3 of the leaves at most, always from the outside, and that plant becomes a steady machine. Cornell's vegetable research notes chard's long, productive window precisely because of this crown-based regrowth. It's one of the most generous plants you can grow in a small space. But chard isn't the only leafy green that refuses to quit after one cut. And that leads us to a plant even more famous for coming back. At number 6 is loose leaf lettuce. Now, most people picture lettuce as a one-and-done crop. You grow a head, you cut the head, and that's the end of the story. But that's only true for the tight heading types like iceberg. Loose leaf and many romaine varieties work on an entirely different principle. And once you understand it, you'll never buy a bag of greens at $4 a pop again. Loose leaf lettuce grows from a base point near the soil, and as long as that base stays intact, it keeps generating new leaves. So instead of waiting weeks for a whole head to mature, then cutting it and starting over, you harvest the outer leaves whenever you want a salad. The plant responds by pushing fresh growth from the center. One planting can give you 4, 5, even 6 rounds of harvest before it finally decides to bolt and go to seed. This is the perfect crop for a shallow container, because lettuce has a small, shallow root system. A window box, a wide pot, just 6 to 8 inches deep, even a recycled salad container with drainage holes punched in the bottom. Fill it with light potting mix, Sow the seeds thinly across the surface and barely cover them because lettuce seed actually needs a little light to sprout. Water gently and keep the surface from drying out while the seeds germinate. The real trick is staying ahead of heat. Lettuce is a cool season plant, and when temperatures climb past 75 or 80 degrees for days on end, it bolts, turns bitter, and stops giving you tender leaves. So, place your pot where it catches the morning sun but escapes the harsh afternoon heat. In the cool of spring and fall, a single shallow box of leaf lettuce can keep 2 people in salad for weeks, harvested leaf by leaf, never all at once. Snip what you need, leave the heart, and let it refill. And that idea that you can cut a plant and let it regrow rather than ripping it out leads us to something you might already have sitting in your kitchen right now. Before we get there, though, I want to share something that goes much deeper than any single plant. Everything we've covered so far, the cut and come again chard, the heat-sensitive lettuce, the regrowth principles behind each crop is mapped out in complete practical detail in the Container Harvest, a digital book available right now through the link in the description at quietfarmliving.com. For $97, you get the full planting system, variety recommendations, container sizing guides, and harvest schedules built specifically around the kind of small space plant wants growing we're talking about today. If you want a single reference that walks you through every decision from soil mix to first harvest and beyond, the Container Harvest is exactly that. You'll find the link waiting for you in the description below. Now, if you already have an established garden and you're thinking these container tips don't apply to you, here's something you can do this very weekend with no special equipment at all. Walk out to your in-ground bed and look at your existing lettuce, chard, or greens. Instead of pulling whole plants, start harvesting only the outer leaves and leaving the centers. That single change turns a one-time harvest into a continuous one, in-ground or in pots, no matter how long you've been gardening. And if you're a nervous beginner who thinks any of this is too advanced, remember you just watched an onion regrow in a glass of water. You can absolutely do this. At number 5, we have green onions, and this one feels almost like a magic trick the first time you see it. Most people buy a bunch of green onions, use the green tops, and toss the white root ends in the trash. But those white root ends are alive. Set them in a little water, and within a few days they begin growing again, right before your eyes. Here's the science behind it. The white base of a green onion holds stored energy and an intact growing point, along with those little roots at the bottom. The plant doesn't know it's been harvested. Given water and light, it simply resumes growing new green shoots from the energy it already has. It's not folklore. It's basic plant biology, and you can watch it happen on a windowsill. To do it, save the bottom inch or 2 of your store-bought green onions, the part with the roots. Stand them upright in a small glass with about an inch of water, roots down, and set the glass on a sunny windowsill. Change the water every couple of days so it stays fresh and clear. In about a week, you'll have new green tops tall enough to snip. Cut what you need, and they keep growing. For an even longer lasting supply, move them into a small pot of soil once the roots establish. In soil, they regrow faster, taste stronger, and last far longer than they ever would in plain water because water alone eventually runs out of nutrients and the regrowth gets thin and pale. A 4 or 5 inch pot of potting mix on a sunny sill will give you snippable green onions for months. This is the gentlest possible introduction to growing your own food because the plant does almost all the work and it costs you nothing but a green onion you already bought. It's also a quiet reminder that the grocery store sells you, again and again, something that would happily keep growing for free on your counter. And speaking of plants that get tougher and more generous the longer you leave them, that brings us to a green that actually gets sweeter when the weather turns cold. At number 4 is kale. And most people assume cold weather is the enemy of a vegetable garden, that the first frost means the season is over. But kale flips that completely. A light frost doesn't hurt kale, it improves it. The leaves turn noticeably sweeter and more tender after a cold snap, which means kale keeps producing long after most other crops have given up for the year. The reason is genuinely clever. When temperatures drop, Kale protects itself from freezing by converting some of its stored starches into sugars, which act like a natural antifreeze inside the leaves. Oregon State Extension research describes this cold sweetening effect in brassicas, and you can taste it directly. Harvest a kale leaf in warm September, and again after a frosty November night, and the November leaf is milder, sweeter, and far more pleasant. The plant is essentially seasoning itself for you. Kale is also a cut-and-come-again champion. Like chard, it grows from a central point and produces from the bottom up. You harvest the lowest, oldest leaves first, working your way up the stem, and the plant keeps pushing new growth from the top. A single kale plant treated this way can produce for many months, and in mild winters it survives right through to spring and starts all over again. For containers, give kale a little more room than lettuce. A pot of about 3 to 5 gallons, roughly 12 inches deep, suits one robust plant well. Use rich potting mix, keep it consistently moist, and give it at least 6 hours of sun, though it tolerates partial shade. Watch for cabbage worms and aphids, which love brassicas. A quick check under the leaves once a week, and a gentle spray of water to knock off any pests usually keeps a container plant trouble-free, because pots already have less pest pressure than crowded ground beds. The common mistake is treating kale like an annual and yanking it after one big harvest. Leave it. Keep picking the lower leaves, let the crown keep working, and one fall planting can carry you deep into winter and sometimes out the other side. It's one of the hardest working plants on this entire list. But everything so far still lives on a scale of months. The next 3 plants live on a scale of years. And that's where this really gets interesting. At number 3, we have rhubarb. And here's where we cross a line. Because rhubarb isn't a plant you replant at all. You put it in the ground one time and it comes back on its own every single spring for 10, 15, even 20 years. It's a true perennial vegetable, which means once it's established, your job is mostly to stand back and harvest. The reason rhubarb is so long-lived is its crown, a thick woody root structure that goes dormant in winter and stores energy underground. Each spring, it sends up fresh stalks from that crown using the reserves it built the year before. It actually needs cold winters to thrive because the dormant period resets the plant. That's why rhubarb is happiest in cooler northern zones and struggles in the deep south, where winters never get cold enough to give it the rest it requires. Rhubarb is a big plant, so if you're growing in a container, go large. A pot of at least 10 to 15 gallons, the size of a half whiskey barrel, gives the crown room to expand and store energy. Fill it with rich, well-draining soil and plenty of compost, because rhubarb is a hungry feeder. Water it deeply and feed it once in spring, and that one investment pays you back for a decade or more. There are 2 rules that keep rhubarb productive for the long haul. First, don't harvest at all in the first year. Let the plant build its crown and its strength. From the second year on, you pull stalks generously through spring and early summer. Second, always twist and pull the stalks rather than cutting them, and never take more than about a third at once, so the plant keeps enough leaves to feed the crown for next year. And one safety note worth remembering, you eat only the stalks. The big leaves are toxic and should never be eaten. Cut them off and compost them. A single healthy rhubarb plant gives you tart, ruby stalks for pies, sauces, and crumbles year after year, with almost no work after that first planting. It's the definition of plant once, harvest for years. But there's a vegetable that goes a step further, one that doesn't just come back, it actually plants itself. At number 2 are perennial bunching onions, including the remarkable variety known as walking onions. And most people don't even know perennial onions exist. We think of onions as something you plant in spring and dig up in summer, done. But these onions never leave. They multiply underground, they regrow from their own clumps, and in the case of walking onions, they literally replant themselves across your garden. Here's how the walking onion earns its name, and it's wonderful. Instead of flowers, the plant grows small bulbs called bulbils, at the very top of its stalk. As those top bulbs grow heavier, the stalk bends over under their weight until the little bulbs touch the soil a short distance away. There, they take root and grow into brand new plants. The onion quite literally walks itself across the bed, one step at a time, season after season, with zero help from you. Ordinary bunching onions work on the same generous principle below ground. One plant divides into a clump, and that clump keeps multiplying. You harvest individual stalks as you need them, leave a few in the ground, and the patch regenerates itself indefinitely. You can grow them in a container as small as 5 gallons, in ordinary potting mix, in full sun to part shade, and they ask for almost nothing. Keep them watered, harvest what you need, and divide the clump every couple of years when it gets crowded. The beauty here is reliability. These onions are tough, cold hardy, and nearly impossible to kill. They green up early in spring when little else is growing, and they offer fresh, mild onion flavor all season long, then come back on their own the next year. Plant a small clump one time, and you may never need to buy green onions again. It's the kind of quiet, self-renewing food source that makes a small space feel surprisingly abundant. But for the single most extraordinary plant once vegetable, the one that turns a one-time afternoon of planting into nearly 20 years of harvests, we arrive at number 1. At number 1 is asparagus. And this is the plant that breaks every assumption about how gardening works. Because asparagus isn't measured in weeks or months. It's measured in decades. A single well-established asparagus bed can keep producing tender spears every spring for 15 to 20 years from one planting. The University of Minnesota Extension and Penn State both note that a healthy asparagus planting routinely stays productive for 15 years or more. Plant it once in the right way, and you may still be harvesting from it when your children are grown. Here's the science that makes such a long life possible. Asparagus grows from a crown, a starburst of fleshy roots that lives underground and gets stronger every single year. In spring, that crown sends up the tender spears we eat. But here's the part most people never understand. If you let some of those spears grow tall, they unfurl into soft, ferny foliage. That fern isn't waste. All summer long, it acts like a solar panel, gathering energy from the sun and sending it back down to feed and fatten the crown. The bigger the crown gets, the more spears it produces the following spring, so the plant doesn't wear out with age. For many years, it gets better. This is why patience at the start matters so much, and it's the one secret almost everyone gets wrong. In the first year after planting crowns, you don't harvest at all. You let every spear grow into fern and feed the crown. In the second year, you take only a light harvest, maybe a couple of weeks. By the third year, the crown is powerful enough to give you a full 6 to 8 week harvest every spring, and it keeps doing that for the better part of 2 decades. Those first 2 patient years are the price of 15 more. And yes, you can absolutely do this in a container, which surprises people most of all. Asparagus needs depth for its roots, so choose a large, deep container, at least 18 inches deep and 20 inches or more across, or a big grow bag of 20 gallons. Fill it with rich, sandy, well-draining soil, because the one thing asparagus crowns will not tolerate is sitting in soggy ground. Plant the crowns about 6 inches deep in early spring, water them well, give them full sun, and feed them each spring with compost. Let the ferns grow all summer, cut them back once they yellow and fall, and wait for the spears to push up again when the weather warms. The mistake that ruins asparagus is harvesting too hard, too soon, or cutting down those ferns while they're still green. Leave the ferns standing through summer. They are the engine. Protect that engine, and one quiet afternoon of planting becomes the most reliable, longest-running harvest in your entire garden. There's something deeply satisfying about a vegetable that simply shows up for you faithfully, spring after spring, year after year, asking for so little in return. And that's the real lesson hidden inside all 7 of these plants. Successful gardening was never about having more land or pouring in more hours. It's about working smarter, not harder. It's about choosing plants that regrow themselves, that store their own energy, that walk across the bed and come back from the cold and keep producing long after the work is done. A few well-chosen pots, planted once with the right vegetables, can quietly outperform a big garden that someone replants from scratch every single year. If you're the kind of person who'd rather grow real, fresh food in the space you actually have, simply and without overspending or overworking, then you already belong here. You don't need perfection. You need consistency and a handful of plants that keep showing up. So here's what I'd love you to do. Go back up to the comments and tell us your growing zone or your state so you and everyone watching can see which of these 7 will keep coming back where you live. Don't just think it, type it out and leave it. It genuinely helps the next gardener who finds this. And if you'd like to keep growing more food with less work and less money, consider subscribing and joining this calm little community of people doing exactly that. Because in the next video, we're looking at a plant that produces more food per square foot than almost anything else you can grow at home, and most people are planting it in completely the wrong spot. Until then, take it slow, keep it simple, and let your garden do the work for you. Before you go, though, there's one more thread worth pulling, because a question always comes up with plants like these, and it's worth answering plainly. People wonder how long they really have to wait before the food starts coming. And the honest, reassuring answer is that you don't wait for all of it. While your asparagus and rhubarb are quietly building their crowns underground in those first patient seasons, the green onions are already feeding you in a week, the lettuce in a month, the chard and kale within weeks of that. You stack the fast plants on top of the slow ones. The quick harvests carry you while the long-term plants get established. That's the real art of a plant once garden. Nothing sits idle, and something is always ready. There's also a simple habit that ties all 7 of these plants together, and it costs nothing. Feed the soil, not just the plant. Every one of these vegetables lives in the same container or the same patch of ground for months or years, which means the soil slowly gives up its nutrients over time. So once each spring, scratch a little compost into the top few inches of every pot and bed. That single handful of compost refreshes the soil, feeds the crown or the roots, and keeps a perennial producing strongly year after year. It's the closest thing to a secret that experienced gardeners share, and it takes about 2 minutes per pot. And here's a gentle reframe to carry with you. We've been taught that a productive garden is a busy garden, full of constant digging, planting, and replacing. But the plants on this list prove the opposite. The most productive garden is often the calmest one, the one where the work happens once, up front, and the harvest happens again and again on its own. A clump of walking onions spreading itself across the bed, a rhubarb crown waking up on its own each April, an asparagus spear pushing through the soil in spring while you simply stand there with your coffee and watch. That's the quiet pleasure of growing this way. You're not fighting your space or racing the seasons. You're partnering with plants that already know how to come back. You plant with intention one time, you learn to harvest gently so the plant keeps giving, and then you let nature handle the rest the way it has for thousands of years. So start small. Pick just one of these 7 this weekend, the one that excites you most, and put it in a pot or a corner of your yard. One plant planted once. Let it teach you how generous a single good choice can be. And when those first spears or stalks or fresh green leaves arrive, season after season, with so little asked of you in return, you'll understand exactly why we grow this way.